What is crack-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you with my certified fantabulous co-host, Mr. Grant Hughes, but we are also joined by frequent guest, reluctant friend of the podcast, Greg Wissinger. He is the editor-in-chief of the King's Herald. They do... No? Isn't that what your role is? Just an editor?
Managing editor.
Managing editor. I apologize. Managing editor of the King's Herald. They have fantastic content over there, so go check them out. Follow him on what we still call Twitter at GWIS. That's at GWISS. Greg, I mean both of you, but we'll ask Greg first because he's the guest. Greg, how are you doing aside from me? I guess giving you a promotion at least.
I prefer to think that we usurped my editor-in-chief, and I'm just going to run with it until he corrects me. But yeah, I'm doing great. Happy that we're just around the corner. We got through August. Like we're finally getting close to training camp and like actual basketball conversations, and not just arguing over the lamest things that we can think of in August. So.
Hashtag world champions.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
Grant, how are you doing?
I'm great. You just triggered me with that world champions thing, though. So I'm going to try to come down before we get into the Kings discussion today. I'm doing well. Thank you.
I'm really excited to do this look ahead because, as I mentioned before we started recording this, we received a lot of hate when we were talking about the Sacramento Kings in our Pacific Division section of the offseason grades. People, some of which I responded with like niceties and they were cordial getting back, but a lot of people said they unsubscribed to our YouTube channel or our podcast feed. It was impressive that we had that many Kings fans subscribed in the first place, I think. So I was very grateful that they were there in the first place. Greg, I am just curious, what are your, before we even get into the meat and potatoes of the certain move that got Grant and I in the most trouble, what were just your general impressions, takeaways, thoughts about Sacramento's offseason?
I mean, like, I can understand. I mean, even among some Kings fans, there's kind of consternation about the way that they went about their offseason and, the lack of a huge on-paper splashy move, right? But I think that there is some value to continuity. They didn't lose any key rotation pieces. Last year was really year one for the majority of this core, and they get to build on that. They had a surprisingly successful season, but now they can kind of take it a step further. They did make some adjustments around the edges, kind of adjustments to the bench unit. And they also removed one of the biggest question marks that would have hung over the entire season by extending Sabonis to a slightly below max extension rather than having his lingering unrestricted free agency hanging out there. And overall, would it have been cool if there was a big splashy move? Of course, I'm a fan. I write about the team. I love big splashy moves. That's the bread and butter. That's what's fun to talk about. But I am happy with the offseason overall. It's not flashy, but I think it has taken a little more criticism than is probably warranted.
I was going to say...
Specifically by you, Dan.
Yeah.
I think I was probably harder, just in fairness to Dan.
I think if the criticism was that they should have done something bigger, if that's what the criticism is really anchored in, I understand that, because what was out there for them to do? We could talk about all the free agents they could have used their cap space on. Like, they weren't getting those guys. This was an unimpressive free agency class. And so there's value in just continuity for sure. I actually don't ding them for that. And I don't know where Grant lands on it. I was just the Sabonis renegotiate and extend, and the mode of operations that went into it based off what they did. They kind of needed to use a first round pick to get off of Rashawn Holmes and to have enough money to not just renegotiate and extend Sabonis, but to do everything else that they did. Keep Harrison Barnes, bring over Vezenkov. And so I'm just like, the renegotiate and extend. Where do you, I know you just said it took it away. It took away the biggest storyline heading into this season. Would he stay? Would he leave? Whatever. Where do you sort of land on it, looking at the number itself, but more so to me, the opportunity cost of what it was to renegotiate and extend Sabonis?
Sure. So, the first thing I always go back to is when the Kings traded for Sabonis, right? The big criticisms were, okay, he's got just over a year or just over 2 years left on his deal. that season was pretty much over. So it was basically, okay, he's got 2 years left on his deal, and then he's an unrestricted free agent. So you've given up Halliburton and team control and all of this to get this guy who, yeah, he's a good player, but is he good enough to actually make your team good? Is he going to stay there long term? And in just over a year, we've moved the goalpost to where, okay, well, they broke the playoff drought in his first full season. They were the 3 seed in the West. Like, they really maximized a team built around him and Fox. And then they also managed to keep him long term. So, like, all the criticisms that were there a year and a half ago are now kind of ignored. And you've got a really good player. He's 27 years old. He's a 3-time All-Star. He was just All NBA. Like, and he is the thing that drives their offense. Like, he is what makes it work on a night in, night out basis. And I think that a lot of the question mark about, the amount of money or, the cost to make it all happen, I think some of that's also tied into recency bias and kind of the way that the Warriors series went, which was a really bad series. And I'm sure we'll kind of dive into that a little bit as well. But overall, he is so valuable to what the Kings do that having that locked in, having that security, I think is worthwhile. And yeah, it did cost him something to move off of Richaun Holmes. The flip side is you could almost, I don't know if it's better or worse, but you could also look at it as, okay, well, maybe that was the money for Harrison Barnes, or that was the money for Vezenkov. It's really that move opened up the money for them to have options. And I don't know if they were necessarily at the time of that move saying that this is the money to, bump up and then extend Sabonis. I think that it was, okay, this gives us the flexibility to pursue X, Y, and Z in the offseason. And worst case scenario, we just lock up our really great center. And we know that, there were reports of other moves that they were looking to make and other things that they tried to do. There was a lot of smoke around them trying to trade for OG Anunoby. And so I think that they went in with a lot of flexibility, and this is what they settled on. And if this is your backup plan, that's great. I don't know. This might have been their first plan all along. Who knows? But I think that there's worse things than, taking care of your guys, taking care of your core. And if they looked at what was available at 24 and weren't in love with any of those guys, like, why not move off and free up the space? Because, they've been trying to move off Holmes for basically a year at this point.
Yeah.
And the cost to move off him was pretty much always going to be a first. And a first is, it's least valuable when you're on the board and you know exactly what's there and you don't like it. So why not?
So I think I can't argue with anything you said, Greg. And I think as I've thought about the off season and Dan's and my take on it and how that has differed so much from certainly the local take, I think, let me try this on you because you talked about the goalpost moving, and I'm curious. I think this is really the root of it. I think Dan and I, trying to take a national perspective, default to evaluating teams' moves on a scale that is probably too one size fits all, which is to say that, like, did you increase your, did you Daryl Morey this? Did you increase your championship equity, right? Like, does the Sabonis move better position this team to win a title, and the thing I think that I'll just speak for myself because I can't speak for Dan on this, but we're sort of aligned. I think the mistake that I may be making, or the reason that my evaluation of the Kings and the Sabonis move comes off harshly, is I'm not evaluating the team or their offseason through the same prism. The goalposts, like you said, for almost 20 years were make the goddamn playoffs. And they did that, right? And so in talking anecdotally to some friends, I would say if they did the exact same thing in 23-24, they make the playoffs, they're out in the first round. Are you happy? Every single person I talked to said, yeah, absolutely. Like, no question. If they win 44 to 48 or 50 games, whatever, and they make the playoffs, this is great. And then and the follow-up is, well, how long would you be okay with that? And the window's pretty wide, like 3-4 years of that would be okay. And I think I'm discounting that in like being harsh on some of the moves they made and didn't make. Does that resonate with you? Is that too broad of a brush to paint the fan base with? Because I think it's important to remember that, especially for this franchise, making the playoffs was a big deal. And just having a team you could follow beyond like January, to be honest, like was a big deal. And it's hard to overstate that. So take that wherever you want to. Am I making up this like unfair stance, or you know what I mean? Like, what do the Kings fans that you talk to feel that way? And is that part of the evaluative process from that side of things?
So I think that the fan base is definitely, I mean, obviously not all. There's definitely always going to be some people that, want more. And, when we talk about moving goalposts, there were Kings fans during last season that were kind of moving their own internal goalpost and, getting upset about things. And we're like looking around like, what are we upset about? Look at this. This is amazing.
We haven't even fired a coach yet.
Yeah. And I do think that, if they did the same thing, and I mean, kind of where I'm at, just kind of tentatively going into the season is, I think that the Kings probably win a few more games than they did last year, probably end up a little bit lower seed just because last year was such a weird year with the seedings and rankings and all that. Like, so yeah, like I don't expect them to be a title contender this year. I also don't think that anyone available at 24, and history has shown us that I could be completely wrong on this, but just looking at the board at that time, there's no one that jumps out at 24 like, man, that was the piece that was going to put him into title contention. So it's like, I get where people come from with quibbling over giving up an asset and discounting the value of a first round pick, because they are valuable and there's things you can do with them. But one of the things you can do with them is unload a bad contract, and that's the way they chose to use it. And that does give them flexibility now where they don't have to go into next offseason worried about preserving money for Sabonis. So they can make trades this season up to the deadline that maybe they couldn't have made before because they needed to be focused on the cap and the unknown of Sabonis and what they're going to do there. So, for this year, I don't know that it made them much more of a title contender than they were before, but I also don't know that there was a move that was realistically out there for the Kings that did that anyway. Now, they've also talked about, they kept all their pieces, and you look at their roster, they really don't have a horrible contract right now. Now, things always change, guys get hurt or guys decline or whatever, so it's all unknown. Some of those contracts could look bad in a year or two, but right now, none of their contracts look bad. They're all very movable deals. They're a variety of different sizes, so they're very easy to kind of mix and match. So if a big trade does come available, they still have the flexibility to do something more as well. They haven't locked themselves into where they have no maneuverability going forward.
I think the thing I struggle with, and I definitely do not think of it through the lens of, okay, they made that pick to clear up additional space, had other plans, and the renegotiate and extend was their backup plan. And so when you kind of view it through that lens, it does make a lot more sense to me. A lot of the pushback we got, and I can't even cite them specifically because I had to turn off, mute that conversation. It just got so bad after we put it out, was that the Kings needed to do this because it made it easier to retain Malik Monk next summer, in part because anyone who was talking about the raw spending, they have his early bird rights, they could have kept him. But you sort of mentioned it with, okay, having the Sabonis number for next year allows them to kind of plan and move forward. I wasn't looking at it as, they missed out on a move. It was, they've made it harder for themselves, to me, to make that bigger move that you speak of by going this route, because you always would have had, if you thought Sabonis was gone, if you didn't renegotiate and extend him, that's a different story. I struggle to believe that was the case when looking at the cap space climate next year, but you always would have known basically what the number was going to be, and you can plan from there. I also don't think, a lot of people point out, the Kings are working with a smaller budget than other people in their division. I honestly just don't care about that. I'm just not going to be a simp or care about owners' pockets for that. In theory, when I'm just judging them. But the other thing is just it wouldn't have gotten harder to move off Richaun Holmes' contract. And now you've kind of removed a prospect from the chamber, even if you didn't, whether it was Omax, whether they would have won a different route there. That's just one less asset now that you can move if you wanted to go out and get an OG Anunoby. And so I'm more looking at it from not an opportunity missed, but opportunities that have yet to arise. I think that's the biggest thing I struggle with. Again, it's not Sabonis specifically. You pointed it out. You could view it as they moved that to make other stuff happen. That's just where I'm coming from, especially when you look at the structure of the roster right now. It is so offense heavy still. They kind of just, and I see the value in that, but they leaned even further into that direction this offseason, it feels like. And so I think that's where I guess my concern / disappointment kind of comes in. If they turn around, they're able to make a big move anyway, despite this, or if Sabonis makes All NBA again, and like you just know you have them locked up, whatever. I'll look like a fool, but I think that's just where I was coming from, looking at why I was so critical of the Kings this offseason.
I will just throw out there real quick. I'll be shocked if Sabonis gets All NBA again now that it's going positionless. Like,
oh yeah,
I'm going to throw out that like tagline that he made All NBA like shamelessly, but realistically, it's probably not happening again. And if it does, then wow, that's really something at that point. But
Greg, I wonder. This is still kind of a Sabonis because heavy line of inquiry, but I think he's such a pivotal figure, not just because of the extension, but because of, as you mentioned, the way the playoffs ended, which, came on the tail end of a phenomenal season, just like a ridiculously statistically productive. And I do think anyone that did not appreciate how much he meant to that offense just wasn't paying attention. So do you think with Sabonis in the role that he is going to play for this team, that the Kings are quote unquote capping their ceiling? Like, is this something that Sabonis needs to become a different player? Not like, completely change his game, but like, let's get 5 threes up a game, or let's work on the lateral mobility. Like, does he need to change to level the Kings up, or is that going to happen in some other way? And you can take that any direction too. Like, what's the way that the defense gets better, or is it Keegan Murray developing, or does any of that really matter if Sabonis is essentially the same awesome regular season, but I think fairly obviously imperfect postseason player?
Well, and I think that part of the downside in the playoffs was really that the Warriors were probably one of the worst matchups in the West for Sabonis specifically. And I think some of the way that it has impacted Sabonis's reputation gets tied into how much we still underrate what Kevin Looney does. Because nightmare matchup, because I mean, Sabonis is a dominant rebounder, and Looney is one of the guys in the league that can kind of hold his own and be on par, especially on offensive rebounds versus Sabonis's tremendous defensive rebounding ability. Like, that was a huge factor. And just the way that the Warriors were able to scheme and adjust between Looney and Draymond, I mean, that was a nightmare matchup for Sabonis. I think that in most series, even if you employed the same tactics, it's not going to work nearly as well as what the Warriors were able to do. I think that they don't get enough credit in their execution of their plan. It's more just, well, look how easy it is to guard Sabonis. You just do this. It's like, no, that's not going to work if like Orlando's out there doing it, or like most other teams, like even other good teams in the West aren't going to be able to pull off what happened in that series. As far as the internal growth, I mean, for Sabonis himself, I mean, yeah, it'd be great if he suddenly developed lateral quickness, but I'm not really holding my breath on that at this point in his career. I think the most realistic thing that he could do that, was kind of glaringly obvious is just be able to, without hesitation, hit like that 15-footer, if he's doing that in that Warrior series, it's completely different, right? And there's a million little things that could have shifted that series too, right? But as far as the internal growth for the Kings, Sabonis is kind of the motor that gets them 80% of the way there. And this is true in regular season as well. In games, he's just kind of the workhorse and kind of gets them through possession by possession towards the end of the game. And then Fox takes over down the stretch. Fox breaking his finger on his shooting hand in that series, I think there's a very good chance the Kings could have pulled that out if Fox could shoot the basketball in the last couple of games. Fox's continued growth is, he took a major leap, and it's difficult to expect yet another major leap, but there's still potential for continued growth. Keegan Murray definitely has shown, some of what he did towards down the stretch of that Warrior series, what he did in Summer League. You expect a player who was a starting player on a good team to be good in Summer League, right? But he kind of showed some abilities that he hadn't demonstrated a lot in his rookie year, so his continued growth is big. And then improving the depth with a guy like Vezenkov, who I think is a real wild card for him this season. So it's really the pieces around Sabonis that are going to get better, ideally. And then as far as the defense goes, I'll again kind of point to that Warrior series. They played some really good defenses for some really long stretches. And it's like, okay, maybe in year 2, Mike Brown gets them to kind of buy in and kind of engage in that level a little bit more often in the regular season. They are probably never going to be a top 15 defense by any means, but if they can be 20 instead of 28, that's a huge, huge difference. And that's kind of my hope on the defensive end, is that the offensive firepower is still there, just as potent or maybe even better, and the defense is just a couple of notches better. I mean, I think that's enough to swing a handful of games right there in any given season or playoff series.
Do you think that was sort of part of this offseason calculus where I'd said before it felt like they leaned further into offense? Were they sort of looking at, you and I discussed this earlier, they had some positive defensive indicators before that Golden State series.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't allow a ton of open jumpers. They defended deep into the shot clock. They're a good defensive rebounding team. I think when you even start to look at like the breakdowns, they probably got a little unlucky just looking at opponents shooting from mid-range and from the 3-point line last year. And so is it part of the calculus where it's, like you just said, we'll never be elite, but like this is closer to a league average defensive team as currently constructed than a bottom 5 or a bottom 3 defensive team?
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say league average. I mean, that's tough to see just looking at the current roster. But yeah, I mean, the hope is continue to be one of the best, or the best offense in the league, and hope that the defense improves a little bit, kind of year over year. And I think that there is opportunity there, because there were, we kind of talk about, I think we talked about this before the playoffs. Yeah, the shooting percentages show that maybe they got unlucky with like opponent 3-point shooting percentage, but watching all the games, there's also kind of like reasons why they might have been. It's like, defensive lapses that lead to a lot more open threes than, and just good looks and guys kind of blowing a rotation or whatever. Cause Mike Brown doesn't run a simple defense. You're expected to be in certain places and do certain things. And the Kings had plenty of guys that were screwing that up, and they might still be screwing it up in year 2. But the hope is that some of those things are becoming more ingrained, and you have a few less mistakes, each game. And, they also got rid of this offseason a lot of the guys that were kind of chiefly responsible for a lot of those lapses. Chimezie Metu, Terrence Davis, guys that were productive on the offensive end, but tended to make big mistakes. When they played bad, it was really, really bad. So they kind of got rid of some of those kind of key lapses as far as the roster went.
So kind of speaking of the roster, I think I'm certainly curious, and I think Dan and I have kind of talked a little bit about him. What do you think Vezenkov is going to bring to the team? I mean, we have a rough, an outline idea of what kind of player he is. How much do you think he's going to play? Whose minutes is he cutting into, if at all? I mean, with Davis gone, maybe nobody's, like what do you think that's going to look like? And how does he contribute here in ways that maybe some other guys from last year's team wouldn't have?
I mean, the first thing is he gives them yet another really great shooter. I mean, you can't just assume the shooting is going to translate, but what he accomplished in your league, I mean, you assume that he'll be a pretty solid NBA shooter. He's got a quick release. He can, catch and shoot with no space. And you put a guy like that with Sabonis, that's a recipe for success that the Kings have shown, right? So it's just adding yet another shooting weapon, and I think initially he'll come off the bench. I don't think they're going to tinker with the starting lineup until they have reason to. But he just gives them another look, another option. I think it's going to be interesting to see how they use it. I think that where the solution probably comes in is we'll see a little bit more of Trey Lyles playing the 5 than he did last year, because they found some success kind of down the stretch and even in, I think, one of the games in the Warrior series. So I think that that's kind of the solution to it, is that especially when matchups allow, you're sliding Trey Lyles down. And so then you've got Vezenkov as kind of the primary backup 4.
I was going to ask, looking at, you had mentioned Murray before, is there room for him to, and we did kind of see it at points last season, but based off what we saw in Summer League, and I wrote in the outline, it was like that Desmond Bane year 2 vibe, where it's like he didn't belong in Summer League. He was doing so many great things on the ball. Then he comes in and he just like absolutely obliterates what he did in year 1. Is there room for Keegan Murray to do that inside an offense where you have Sabonis being used the way that he does, and you have someone in De'Aaron Fox who just was absolutely incredible, another All-NBA player, one clutch player of the year, hit like one of the best finishers on drives, hit 37+% of his step back threes. When you're just looking at how established the two primary options already are on this team offensively, is there going to be enough runway for Keegan Murray to, I guess, hit the top end percentile of his like best case outcome?
I think there is, because if you really look at the way that the Kings played most of the year, and they talked openly about this, it was kind of no secret that kind of the first 3 quarters, a lot of times, Fox would have some points here and there, but wouldn't be doing a whole lot. And then he would just kind of take over for the team in the fourth. But even when he was doing that, he was still keeping an eye for open shooters and kicking the ball out and moving the ball. It wasn't like he got tunnel vision on it. So there's still going to be opportunities there. But, those first 3 quarters, especially, Sabonis, he's the engine that drives it all, but it's not that he's driving it all to get his own points. So, he's distributing, he's hitting guys who are moving. And that was a lot of Keegan's success in year one, was, moving off of Sabonis screens and things like that. So I think there's definitely still an opportunity for him to do more. It's just going to be the situations last year where he catches it and the defender's too close, so he just moved the ball and kept it moving. Maybe this year he puts it on the deck every now and then to keep the defense a little bit more honest. I think that's kind of the natural next progression. And then hopefully a little bit of improvement on defense. Like if he can be a better defender, and there's some limitations there. I don't think he's ever going to be an elite defender or anything, but I think that there's room for him to grow into more than what he was as a rookie. That goes a long way towards him as an overall player, as well as that team defense that we're talking about, and kind of how do you improve there. Keegan's a place where there could be some improvement on the margins.
How would you evaluate Murray's defense? Being a rookie, he's an older rookie, so everybody assumes, oh, this he's still a rookie. So the NBA adjustment is always incredibly difficult. Would you characterize his shortcomings defensively as physical or mental? Like he's, because you would expect the latter from a rookie, just to, blown assignment, or he gets back cut here, or he, chases over the top when he shouldn't, like all those types of things. Were they those types of mistakes? Just, not asking for stats on it or anything, or do you think he actually is in the right place a lot? It's just he's a little bit physically limited in that role, especially if he's going to be kind of a wing stopper, assuming Barnes, slows a little bit as he continues to age.
Yeah, I think that some of it is that there are some physical limitations, right? Like he just doesn't have, that kind of lateral quickness that the elite defenders have, right?
Yeah.
But there's so few of them in the beginning.
Everybody needs those, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. But I think some of it was also just, not that he was in the wrong place, but, just not always, maybe just a half beat slow on recognizing what was about to happen, or, kind of where to be. And, I think in that normal rookie way, right, that you could easily, especially for a player who has shown, kind of a good growth path and smart, hard worker, all those different things. He adjusted, and we saw a lot of growth from him, just over the course of last season. So I think that there's definitely, again, I'm not expecting him to ever be an elite defender, but I think he can be a better defender than what he was, and especially like a better defender than what they have in like Harrison Barnes right now.
Yeah. No.
What is the outlook for Davion Mitchell with this team now? There's like this weird disconnect to me where it feels like he is incredibly important right now just because of how limited some of their personnel is on the defensive end, but he's extension eligible, will be a restricted free agent next summer, and there just doesn't feel like a long-term fit with this team.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird spot. And I think that, if you told me that Davion was traded at the deadline, I wouldn't be shocked. I think that he's one of their more appealing trade assets because, whoever gets him still has team control, especially if there's a team out there that thinks he could do more in a bigger role. The challenge with him has really been his offense being inconsistent. If he had a steady 3-point shot, or just even a consistent shot at any level, he'd be incredibly valuable, and he'd probably see a lot more minutes playing alongside De'Aaron Fox. But as it is right now, with his shooting being unreliable, it makes it challenging, kind of who you compare him with, what you can do, without it impacting the looks that the defense is going to throw at you. I don't know. Like I I still believe in Davion. I do think he's incredibly important, and it'd be tough to lose him just because he is one of the few really good defenders on the roster. But I think that there's a decent chance that he gets traded before the deadline.
Staying on the topic of defense, I can definitely remember thinking, and Dan, you and I have probably talked about this. I know I've written about it. In the early Fox years, him to me projecting as a massively disruptive defensive weapon. I just thought that physically, athletically, the way he could jump passing lanes, his length, his quickness, and maybe you correct me, but I do feel like there were periods there where it was almost the expectation that this guy, at least tools wise, was going to be an amazing defensive guard. And now it's at the point where he's so good that it's almost and his importance to the offense is such that like we don't really ask about why Damian Lillard and why John Morant aren't shutting down everybody they go up against, because they got other things to worry about, and Fox I think is there. But do you see him as someone that is it just a workload thing? Is it a why? I guess the short question is, why is he not the kind of dominant defensive piece that his physical ability seems to suggest he could be?
And we actually noticed a big difference last season. Still not, from buzzer to buzzer, not a great defender, but especially in fourth quarters, he would really engage, and he used those tools exactly like we always thought he could, right? And I think a big reason we never saw it before was, frankly, look at the situation he was in.
Right.
Like, who's going to kill themselves for defense for as bad a teams as they were? Like, but Mike Brown, when he showed up, like, he did it in like his opening press conference. He called out that De'Aaron Fox needed to be a better defender. Like, and he got Fox to buy in from day one. And we definitely saw him improve. And that was a big part of what made the team as a whole better in that Warrior series, was that Fox was engaged a lot more. Now, from a workload perspective, I don't think it's realistic to expect that, throughout the course of an 82 game season, all four quarters or anything like that. I think he could probably be a little bit better than he was, especially kind of earlier in games. Like, don't give up the easy stuff early and you don't have to do the hard stuff later. But, we definitely saw him more engaged and make some really incredible defensive plays, especially late in games, especially close games. And then in the playoffs, he was playing really good defense a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Definitely room for growth, but I think he's such a huge part of their offense, especially their fourth quarter offense, that part of it at this point is just kind of saving him to where he still has something in the tank for that.
Is that like, insofar as there is a next frontier for him, is that like the next frontier for him just based on everything he already does on offense? And I would agree. Like, I think he got better, or at least, I felt him more on defense watching the show. Like, he didn't feel like he was just kind of stiff, rigid, upright a lot of the time. And so that clearly went a long way. But like, what does the next frontier look like for a player who's entering year 7? But it kind of just feels like he only just turned the corner, because you and I have talked year in, year out about how he's like faded, like, or started poor and then finished strong, or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, last year was the first time he had a great year from start to finish, right?
Yeah.
Like he hasn't done that before in his career. It's always been broken in the thirds, where he'd have like a terrible third of the year, a great third of the year, and a meh third of the year. And you never knew where in the year those three sections were going to be. It was always different. But last year, he really put it all together with consistency. I do think consistency on the defensive end is the more likely way for him to improve. I mean, obviously, more consistency on an outside shot. He wasn't bad. He was respectable from deep last year, which is huge with a guy with his speed and everything. But I'm less concerned with that, just because the way that he is able to use kind of the stop and pop mid range and get to the rim and all that, it's like, all right, if you're doing those two things at that elite level, you don't necessarily need to have the 3-point shot, because that mid range pull up is enough to keep the defenses from just sitting in the paint, and he can pick them apart if they're doing that. So it'd be nice if he could consistently hit threes, but I think
that was on step backs. He's at like 39% the past 2 seasons on step back threes. It's wild.
But I definitely think that being more engaged all season long on defense would be big, and not just for him as a player taking the next step. But for the Kings as a whole, right? I mean, he's the guy. Him and Sabonis are setting the tone, and Sabonis doesn't have the skills to become a really great defender. Fox does. Whether that's the best use of his energy, who knows? But if he could do that with a little bit more consistency, I think it does kind of set the tone a little bit more for the team. And then, maybe that's where we see that improvement to where they're no longer a bottom 5 defense. Again, we have low bars for success. So
you mentioned Mike Brown, and it made me wonder, because and you also talked about how his defense is not necessarily easy to play, and their offense may look simple because when it really matters, it's just it becomes a 2-man game, which it should, which every good team that has guys like that can do. Over the course of last year, did you see maybe the execution improving as the team, because ridiculous continuity? So that starting 5, everybody started, I think Fox was at 73 games or something, which was the least of that starting 5. Did you see them maybe executing what Brown wanted them to do more consistently? Was that something that visibly happened over the course of the year? And I guess the follow-up to that would be, how much of their growth potential really just comes from everybody's got a full year of understanding what is expected of them on both ends, and that just means they're going to be 5% better at it or whatever. So two-parter, I guess. Was there growth that you could see, or just like aha moments? And will that translate if you did see anything like that?
Yeah, we definitely saw some adjustments and growth as time went on. I mean, as they got better at executing it, we also saw them introducing new wrinkles to it. And, kind of what we heard was that I don't think even by the end of the year, they were really at Mike Brown's full playbook, because they needed time to kind of get used to running, the base sets and then kind of the second options, and, just kind of building, those building blocks until they could get it right and do it all well. So I think that there is still room for that offense, as crazy as it sounds, because it was an incredible offense, but there's opportunity for it to be even better. Now, whether or not that'll happen, I think that's a really lofty goal because the offense was so good. I think I don't want to put a lot of hope in the offense can be even better. That seems like maybe setting yourself up for disappointment, because realistically, I think they had the best offense. I don't know if they finished the year, but at one point they had the best offense in NBA history.
I think that's right. I think that
for offensive rating. So it's when you do that, it's tough to say it's going to be 5% better next year.
Right.
So I do think that more of the growth should come on the defensive end, even if it is kind of incremental growth. And part of hopefully, I say hopefully because you never know, with offseason moves, hopefully the depth is better. That's the goal of the moves that they made, so the better depth could help offset if they do, have a few more injury, missed games and things like that. But I do also think it's worth noting, because a lot of the criticism I see with people projecting the Kings lower is, well, they had such good injury luck. They had almost nobody missing time to injuries. Well, that happened because Sabonis should have missed 2.5 months, and he just played through a broken thumb the whole year.
Right.
And multiple guys were playing through things. They had that, no, we are getting there this year. We are not making any excuses. We're not missing time. They were a team on a mission, and so they definitely still had injuries. They just played through a lot. I mean, there was a little stretch where Fox was clearly hampered by some injuries, and they finally had to shut him down for a couple of games because he wasn't playing at 100%, but he was still playing through. So the injury missed games numbers wasn't really indicative of how banged up those guys were throughout the year.
2 players on this team I'm fascinated by, so I'm going to loop them together. Who has a bigger role this year, Chris Duarte or Kessler Edwards?
Duarte, unless he's hurt or just still can't find his footing. I think the expectation is that he is a bigger piece. I think Kessler Edwards is still raw. He's shown some flashes, and he's young, he's cheap, he's a great piece to have. He's kind of a luxury depth piece. But I would expect that Duarte has the bigger role.
What is the theory then of Chris Duarte on this team? Just when you have Fox, you have Malik Monk, who was in the 6th man of the year running last year. You have Sabonis. You want more touches or more exposure for Keegan Murray. I think a lot of what Chris Duarte, like he had great chemistry with Sabonis in Indiana.
Mhm.
And so I would agree with you that I think they're definitely going to give him the bigger role just by virtue of that familiarity. But it's like that, just the theories, they're going to try and sort of tune into that. Maybe see a lot of him like staggered from a De'Aaron Fox situation. I think the value they got him for was absolutely like, that was a great flyer to take. I just still struggle a little bit to see the full utility of him when the roster looks the way it does right now.
I think it was more, I mean, definitely they're looking for that chemistry with Sabonis, right? I think they're definitely going to look for opportunities, especially early in the season. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of, lineup staggering where Duarte is on the floor with Sabonis so that he's in the best position to get off to a good start and kind of find his footing after a rough sophomore year. But I think the biggest thing is just that, he's versatile. He's got some size. He's got some shooting. That's pretty much all Monty McNair's looking at. He's like, all right, I've got Fox, I got Sabonis. I'm going to put every shooter I can find around him. Guys that can move off ball and kind of get an open look for Sabonis to find him. That's where Duarte was really good. And, outside of Halliburton, there wasn't a lot of guys finding other guys in Indiana. It was an offense built very much around guys creating their own shots. And that wasn't a situation where Duarte was going to thrive. And the team just moved on and, not to fault them. They've got good guys that deserve to play over Duarte last year, especially with the injuries. But for as young as he is, as good as he was his rookie year, I think it's just a good flyer. And they're like, hey, he's a young guy and, a guy who can play the 2 or maybe slide down to the 3 a little bit. Like, can't have enough of those guys with Fox and Sabonis.
I like how we're talking about, and it's real, but how Duarte has great chemistry with Sabonis. Like, find me the player that has bad offensive chemistry with Sabonis, and then tell that guy to look in the mirror and ask,
right.
What's wrong with me? If you can't play with Sabonis, it's on you, man. What else you got, Dan? Do you want to get to the cookie cutter questions or anything else?
I had one more question about sort of the front line. How many wins is JaVale McGee worth? No, but
like 30.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So they'll go like 83-0 in the 82 game season. Well, I guess they could play 83 because of the new in-season tournament. Technically,
well, yeah, obviously they're going to win that, so they got 83 games, and
What is like? How do you sort of see the secondary frontline rotation shaking out? You already kind of mentioned that Trey Lyles might play a lot of 5 to perhaps or to make room for Vezenkov, and so like, does that just mean like we're going to see very limited JaVale McGee or Nerlens Noel? Like, it could get pretty jumbled because of the 4 and 5 just combos they have, but is it just they're viewing these actual centers that they have behind Sabonis is just, well, if we get like stuff from them at any given point, that it's a bonus, and we're going to probably just try and run with the spacier lineups when again we're looking at that secondary front court rotation.
Well, there were a lot of stretches of last season where they weren't getting stuff from their backup center position. So I kind of understand why Monty McNair is like, bring me all the options. Like, we'll put them all in camp and figure out what we got. I think, if I had to guess today how it shakes out, I think that Nerlens Noel probably doesn't make the team. I think he had a very good shot of making the team before JaVale became available and they went out and got him. I think that, behind Sabonis, you're probably looking at Alex Len and JaVale McGee, and then, Trey Lyles with some small ball 5. I think that who plays more is going to be very lineup or matchup dependent. I think that Len will probably be the primary backup center, just because they did have some success with him down the stretch last season. And even in the playoffs, he had some good moments. And then, Lyles. And I think that JaVale will be used sparingly, or when they really feel like they need that rim protection, or those 5 extra fouls, or whatever it might be. But I think mostly with him, they're looking at a veteran, a guy who's been there, a guy with playoff experience, guy who can block shots. There's a local writer in Sacramento who had a great stat that over the last 2 years, JaVale has blocked like 107 shots, and that's more than the next 2 guys on the Kings combined over the last 2 years. Like, they've had no rim protection, like no one. And one of those top 2, I think, was for Sean Holmes, who's gone. Like, so it's like they haven't really had rim protection. So he just gives them that different skill set that they've been lacking. And, there's times when they really, really were glaringly lacking that. And, so I think that JaVale will be there, but I don't see him being a regular rotation player. I could be wrong, but if I had to guess right now, Mike Brown showed us last year that, like, if he feels like Alex Len isn't working out, he's going to switch it up, and, he'll give him, games. He's not going to overreact to one game or anything like that, but if it's not working, he'll change it up and try something else for a stretch.
So what does right now with the roster currently constructed, what does that 10-man rotation like look at? Because it's actually kind of, I feel like there are probably locks, but this is one of the rare, really good teams where after you go through like the top 6 spots, there's probably a good amount of questions thereafter.
Sure. So I'm just making sure I've got the roster here so I'm not missing anyone. So obviously you got your starting 5, Sabonis, Fox, Herter, Barnes, Keegan Murray, Malik Monk, Davion, Sasha Vezenkov, Trey Lyles. And then if I had to guess, I'd say the 10th man at this point would probably be Duarte or Len. I do think that they will probably have a fairly deep rotation through the regular season. I don't see them doing like 8 or 9 man because they just have the depth and they can throw different looks and keep guys fresh. And so I think that they will try a lot of different things, but that would be my guess, is right now the 10th spot is either Duarte or Len.
I think Monk is obviously the lock to play the most minutes outside the starting 5. Who do you think plays the most off the bench if we exclude Monk?
It's either Davion or Vezenkov. I have really lofty hopes for Vezenkov. They acquired his rights like a year ago, so we had like the whole last year to kind of watch what he was doing and get familiar with his game and kind of watch how great a season he had overseas. And it's exciting to have him coming in and kind of joining in. I think it's probably a little bit of an underrated move when we talk about there wasn't the big splash, right? And he's going to be an older rookie. He's not, a young guy that's going to become a superstar for the team, but I think he's going to be one of those really valuable pieces, and I'm excited for him.
Yeah. If he can do anything, that second unit, especially if Lyles is playing the 5 and they're spacing the floor, him and Monk, and that could be, maybe that'll be the best offense in NBA history.
What's something about this team that flies under the national radar as we head into next year?
Everything. All
right.
Hopefully not after this year, because this year they do have like 22 national TV games, but they were on national TV like twice last year. There was like ample opportunities to get flexed in, and they even like flexed the Kings out of a national TV game, even when it was clear they were really good. So I think that, the playoffs, I think, were a bit of a wake up call for everyone. We heard during broadcast, like all the national guys being like, I hadn't really watched the Kings. It's like, they're the 3 seed, like since like January, like where you been? I do think that, just how fun they are on a night in, night out basis. That was a great series with the Warriors, but it also wasn't really at the level that the Kings usually operate, just because, again, the Warriors defense was doing a really good job against them. And they had some of their key shooters just not hitting shots. But when the Kings are on, they're just so much fun to watch. It's just such a fun brand of basketball. And, I still think that that Kings Clippers double overtime game was one of the craziest things we've ever seen, and just one of the best games. It's like, good thing they didn't put that one on TV, huh? They had the choice between that or some random crappy Suns game, and they went with the Suns game because they wanted Durant's debut, and he didn't play that night.
I don't think that's going to happen too much this year. Like you said, they got 20 national games.
22.
22.
Yeah.
What an age! What a time to be alive,
right? I think Wemby only had 13, if I'm not mistaken. So congrats to the Kings.
Spurs had a lot. They had quite a bit. I get the Wemby draw. Like, that's still probably going to be a rough team this year, though.
Yeah,
it'll be fun to watch for basketball sadists like us, but
I'm gonna
fans
pull off of the outline here, because I am curious if this is an easy question or not. This team's closing lineup is the starting lineup, right? Unless like somebody like gets stuck on the bus or something? Or like, is there any matchup that, you know, you could envision where maybe Monk is in there for somebody, or is this just you throw your best 5 out there, which is the first unit, and that's going to close the vast majority of games?
One of the reasons the Kings were really good last year was that they had the depth and the flexibility to just kind of go with whoever was having a good night. So, you know, there were plenty of nights when Monk closed instead of Herter just because Monk was on that night and Herter wasn't. And I think that they'll keep doing the same thing. I mean, you know, if someone off the bench is doing well and Harrison Barnes is having a quiet night, Harrison Barnes might be on the bench, or Keegan Murray spent a lot of closing minutes on the bench last year. I mean, Mike Brown does not play favorites or care who you are. Like if you're not feeling it that night, he's going to find someone who is. And I think the most common starting lineup or closing lineup would be the starting 5, but I think there's going to be a lot of times when they do kind of mix and match just based on who's having a good night.
Is there what's a weirdo, wacko lineup you would like to see them try this year?
Ooh, this is always a fun one. So 2 different weirdo lineups I'd like to see. You know, one is kind of the whoops all fours, where you know they've got a million power forwards, so just play all of them. You know, have like Harrison Barnes run the point, and then Keegan and Vezenkov, and you know, just
That
Lyles
was mine.
and
Was
yeah,
Lyles and Sabonis, and then the
Yeah.
3 forwards.
Yeah.
I want to see that.
That's not that bad.
it would. We could see it, right? Like,
Well, I mean, like all of those guys can handle the ball. Lyles, like
Yeah.
not as well, but like in open space, yeah, that's fine. So
I mean,
sign me up.
realistically, in that lineup, Sabonis is just bringing the ball up like he does most of the time anyway.
Right.
So yeah, you don't need a point guard when you got Sabonis on the floor, and the rest of the guys are all shooters still. Like, it could work. It could be interesting.
Is it time for over under, Dan? Are we there?
Yeah.
Man, this number is so brutal.
It is.
They're always so. I feel like I say that about everyone, but so currently it's 44.5 is their over under for regular season wins this year. Greg, over under that? I wish I could just say 44.5 sounds right, but we can't. And then you alluded to this at the top, whether their record may be better for several reasons, but you suggested, and I think I kind of agree with you, that the rest of the West is kind of bubbling. There's a half dozen teams that I think we would say underachieved in the West last year record wise.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you see them slotting in the West with whatever that win total ends up being?
So I think that they'll probably go over 44.5. But if they do, it's going to be barely. Like, I would not bet on that line at all. Like last year, I was looking at the Kings over under and like hammer the over.
It was so easy.
It was ridiculous. This year, it feels pretty right. Like, you know, a couple wins better than last year. Like, you know, I think that it's pretty spot on. I think, yeah, I'll take the over because it is so close. And, you know, if it's close, I'm a Kings fan, I'm going to say over. As far as where they slot in the rankings, I would say probably somewhere in the 4 to 6 range, possibly lower. But I mean, you look kind of historically in the West, like 45 wins is usually like 7, 6, somewhere in there. Some years 8 or 9. Like, I mean, the West is going to be brutal this year, but I do think that there still is going to be some of that cannibalism, you know, especially in the Pacific Division. Like, the fact that all those teams play each other 4 times is insane. Like,
what are the teams that you would say, because the West is going to be brutal, but it's also feels wide open. Like I was trying to go through this before. The number of teams that I would predict finish with more wins than the Kings, like just guarantee it right now, I stopped at 2, and I have the Suns and the Nuggets. And like, I'm not even fully confident in the Suns just because of like the availability of Kevin Durant specifically, and just, yeah, they hit home runs with minimum guys, but whenever you're relying a bunch on minimum guys, there's margin for error there.
And it's not like Durant stays healthy reliably either. Like, that's the other thing.
Right. And so, like, would you add any team to that list? Like, or is that, do you think that's right? Like, there are 2 teams that you could maybe guarantee will finish with more wins than, and look, even the Nuggets might be risky because relative to what's happened to them the past few years, they got really lucky on the health front last season as well, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's pretty safe to put Denver ahead. I think it's reasonably safe to put Phoenix ahead, but I'm gonna have my own nitpicking with their roster construction because I think that we're like, look at all these guys they got on the minimum. It's like, yeah, but it's a bunch of guys who should all be like the 8th or 9th guy, and they're gonna have to be like the 6th guy.
Yeah.
Like it, when as a Kings fan, I know when you take the guy and put him like 3 spots higher in the rotation than he should be, it doesn't go well. Like,
Right.
spent years watching that, and it's like, oh, that guy, he's an NBA player, absolutely. And then you put him in too big a role, and you're like, oh no, that's a disaster. Like, so I have my concerns about Phoenix, but I mean, on a night-to-night basis, they've got enough talent. They'll probably have more wins. I'd feel pretty comfortable with that. But yeah, I mean, the rest is wide open. I mean, I think outside of like Houston, San Antonio, and Portland, just because I'm assuming at some point Dame's traded, like any other team, if you told me they finished with more wins than the Kings, I'd be like, all right, sure. Like,
Yeah. You could
Utah
see,
might be a little weird, but I could see it. Like, who knows?
3 to 12 could
Yeah.
fall in almost any order, and it wouldn't be. Yeah, I guess I'd
Throw
agree.
your
that
darts.
You actually said something before that made me think of something else. If the King, or maybe it was when Grant was talking, saying that fans might just be happy making the playoffs again. Where does that leave the Kings in the context of, okay, this season leading into the trade deadline, or just trying to evaluate themselves against the rest of the Western Conference? Are they a team that will be aggressive to look for upgrades? And I think it's just pretty clear we need to be like on the wing defender market. You mentioned OG Anunoby. There will be other names that become available, like Lou Dort. Just a lot of stuff's going on in Oklahoma City right now that could sort of squeeze him a little bit. Like, are they a team that we should be watching to actively try to upgrade the roster midseason, or is it more kind of they're okay with this stasis of we're going to make the playoffs again? Like, we need to see more from a lot of these guys anyway, Murray, Vezenkov, and we just trust that Sabonis and Fox might make, past the halfway point that they might continue to make progress.
So the one thing I've kind of come to understand about Monty McNair as a GM is that he's always looking for the opportunity, but he kind of knows his price and is perfectly happy to stand pat. So if you told me that post-trade deadline, this roster is more or less the exact same as it is now, that wouldn't surprise me. If you told me they made a huge swing for a guy, that wouldn't surprise me either. I think if the right opportunity comes along, they will absolutely be aggressive, but they aren't going to shake things up for the sake of shaking things up.
Okay.
So, I mean, we saw it with, how many years did we think he was going to trade Harrison Barnes? And he just never has. And then he resigns the guy. So, I think that they're perfectly willing to be patient if they don't see the value there. But the instant they see something they think makes sense to improve the team, they're going to jump at it. So, I mean, hell, they traded Tyrese Halliburton. I mean, if there's anything to show you that they're not afraid to make a big move, like
that feels like a trillion years ago.
It
Really I was
does.
just shitting all over
it
that.
was
trade.
a year and a half ago.
Yeah, it feels like a trillion ago.
Yeah.
Did we not ask you about anyone or anything related to this roster, this team that you think needs to be covered?
The only thing, and it's kind of a minor thing, but Colby Jones. I mean, he was there kind of early in the second round draft pick. With the current roster, there's not going to be a huge need for him to play a ton of minutes, but I wouldn't be surprised if he gives them, some good minutes here and there, just kind of spot minutes, similar to how they'll use Kessler Edwards. Like, they'll just throw him in, but I think there's an NBA player there, not like a superstar or anything like that, but I think there's an NBA player there.
You're going to say something, Grant?
I was just going to, my last question was going to be just, how good of an ambassador are you? And can you reach out to the Kings fans we've alienated and let them know that we're not the worst people on earth?
Yeah, big ask. It's a big ask. Half Kings fans think I'm the worst person on earth too. So I'm probably the wrong ambassador.
Greg, this was great as always. Thank you so much for coming on and dropping buckets of knowledge and not as much spite as I thought was going to come from your end of the spectrum. But
winning has softened me.
Are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the work that you do, and maybe even tell them your proper title?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at GWIS, GWISS. You can also follow the King's Herald at the King's Herald and kingsherald.com. That's our kind of primary place where we've got, that's our articles, our merch, our podcasts, all of that's posted there. But yeah, that's the biggest thing is, just check us out there. We're completely independent, fan supported. We don't have any corporate backing or anything like that. So, we're just out there doing our own thing and not taking ourselves too seriously.
Well, thank you so much as always. And I think, as you know by now, this podcast will be pestering you again in the future.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.